You know, at the core of that song, at the core of the message from last week, is recognizing our insufficiency, especially as we look to Christ, who is utterly sufficient for every need that we have. Right? And as we see his sufficiency, hopefully that leads us to understand just how insufficient we are to care for our own needs. Right? And that's a great segue into what we're going to learn about today as we go to Mark chapter 6, starting in verse 30. But before we get there, I just want to ask you a question. Have you ever in your life felt incredibly insufficient? I mean that not just like personally, but just circumstantially. Have you ever been in a situation like maybe you have a friend who's just in dire straits and you just don't know how to help them? Or maybe you have a child who is running far away from the Lord and you just don't know what words of wisdom to give to them. Or maybe there's marital strife and you just don't know what the next step is. Or maybe on a bigger scale, you're looking at this world and how broken it is, and you have no idea how on earth something so broken could ever be put back together again. And when you look at these circumstances and you look at what you have, like what you can contribute, like the need is so vast and what you have is like so microscopic. How on earth could what you have make any difference at all? Like, am I alone in feeling that way? I think all of us, to a certain degree, have felt that way. But what if the issue is not at all if we have enough? What if the real question is about what will I do with what I have? Because looking at what's in my hand, as small as it is, that's still me through the vantage point of looking at my sufficiency. Here's what I have. But at the core of the lesson today is looking at what God has and his provision, his sufficiency, his ability to do with that tiny little seed in your hand, right? And multiply that and use it for his kingdom purposes. And sometimes God allows us to be in circumstances that far exceed our resources so that we will learn to trust in his provision. It's one thing to read about it, it's another thing to live it out. Right? So, with that framework in mind, and I also want to tell you, today there's going to be a lot. There's a lot packed into this message. It's the story of feeding the 5,000. It's a very familiar passage to many of us. So, don't try to remember everything. Right? This is going to be on the website. The text will be there. The sermon will be online. I really want to challenge you. There's so much to this. Like, this is going to be kind of like a big spread on a table. There's going to be something here that speaks to all of us, but it's not going to be the same thing that speaks to all of us. All right, so just take that one thing that speaks to you, and that's what I want you to run with this week, right, in this month, and into the future. Come back to it again later. There will be something else for you, right? But don't try to take it all in, because I'm only going to be able to just breeze the surface of everything that's in this passage of Scripture. But let's read this together. Mark chapter 6, starting in verse 30. So the apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a remote place and rest for a while." For many people were coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. So they went away in the boat by themselves to a remote place, but many saw them leaving and recognized them, and they ran on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. And when he went ashore, he saw a large crowd and had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Then he began to teach them many things. And when it grew late, his disciples approached him and said, "This place is deserted, and it's already late. Send them away so we can go into the surrounding countryside and villages, or so they can go there, and to buy themselves something to eat." "You give them something to eat," he responded. They said to him, "Should we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat?" And he asked them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. And he instructed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. And he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. Looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke the loaves. And he kept giving them to his disciples to set before the people. And he also divided the 2 fish among them all. Everyone ate and was satisfied. They picked up 12 baskets full of pieces of bread and fish. Now those who had eaten the loaves were 5,000 men. Like, have you ever been in a crowd that big? That's a lot of people. And I think if we don't sit down and take the time to think of just how impossible this request was for the disciples, we're going to miss out on a huge impact that this text has for us. So let's go through this step by step. Again, there's going to be a lot here. Focus on what's really impactful for you, what you feel like God is speaking to you in this moment right now. But let's begin with this call to rest. The stage is set. So Mark took a little bit of a break from what the disciples were doing, because last week we read about the death of John the Baptist. So that was a little bit of a pause in the middle of the story of how Jesus is teaching his disciples. So the story of where the disciples left off was that they were sent out into the region, to the region of Galilee and beyond, probably, we don't know. But they were sent, right, with the bare minimum basics that they needed. They couldn't take anything extra. They couldn't take any extra food, no extra clothes, right? No provisions for where they were going to stay. And they were supposed to proclaim the gospel. They were supposed to teach about Christ. And they were supposed to back that up with the very power that Jesus was demonstrating, right, through miraculous powers of healing and casting out demons. And that's what they did. So now they're coming back and they're essentially giving a mission report. They were sent out 2 by 2, so this is the first time they've seen everybody else, much less Jesus. And again, we don't know how long of a time that was, but this was an incredible time of celebration. I mean, just imagine coming back and knowing what you experienced when you went out into the region, right? And you saw the provision of going and relying on the generosity of others to bring you into their house and feed you. Not to mention, right, the being released from the forces of darkness and the sick made whole again. All those things that you saw just with you and the person that you were traveling with. Right? But then you come around and you hear that report from the other 10, and you see like just the countenance of Jesus' face as he's taking all this in. That would have been an amazing time of fellowship and celebration at what Jesus sent you to go do. But it was pretty limited, because not only did the disciples return, but evidently people from all the towns that they were ministering in followed them. There was a crowd that came there. So this is really cut short to the point where they didn't even get a chance to eat together. So Jesus, looking at them, I'm sure they were exhausted and tired. Evidently they were hungry. They didn't get a chance to eat. And Jesus saw this amassing crowd coming. So they got in a boat, and then they went and sailed over to Bethsaida. One of the other Gospels tells us that. But evidently their boat was visible enough for the crowd to see them and recognize them. So they followed them over. But in the midst of this, Jesus is telling his disciples to rest. Like, you need to take some time. We're going to go to this remote place, and you're going to rest. You need this. Later on, we'll see Jesus' compassion over that crowd. Right now, Jesus is demonstrating his compassion over his own people. So the first lesson for us is that Jesus, the Lord of creation, who established the rhythm of work and Sabbath rest at the beginning of time, is now instructing his disciples to do the same. He does not want them to conflate, right, all of this energy in expending themselves, right? Conflating exhaustion for effectiveness. Because that happens a lot in ministry. You spin your wheels, you're so busy doing, you forget to rest, and then you burn out. Right? And then you quit and you do something else. But Jesus is demonstrating, no, you need to rest. I want to give you that rest. So this was a mercy for them. Because again, imagine, just put yourself in their shoes. How exhausted they must have been. Walking from town to town, now coming back, seeing the crowd. They're already exhausted by the crowd, but now just facing, like, in exhaustion. If you've ever been exhausted and then realize that you have to do it again, like, that's hard. So Jesus takes them on the boat, He's going to take them to a remote place. So I want us to understand as we get started in this story, the same God that told us to go and disciple the nations is the same God that tells us to come and rest. Both are imperative commands that are given in a sovereign love for his people to show them how to continue to endure and persevere to be a witness for him. But now, before they land, they can see almost like this giant swarm of bees on the land just kind of working their way around. And they beat them there. Like imagine 5,000 men, and as Matthew tells us, their wives and their children with them. So in reality, this is probably at least 10,000 people, if not 15,000 people or more. If you just take an average of, a 3-person household in a time where there, was no birth control, that's a pretty conservative number. So 15,000 people working their way around the Sea of Galilee to come meet them where they were. That had to have been intimidating because the people on land, Mark says, could see them, so people on the boat can see the crowd coming. But Jesus is taking them up to a remote place. Now, the word for that word remote in Greek is a desolate place. It is a wilderness. We've talked about before. There's an ongoing theme in Scripture about wilderness as a place of testing. It's a place of refinement. It's a place of having to trust. It's God revealing both human weakness and divine sufficiency. That's where Jesus is leading them to. Into the wilderness. We'll actually pick up on this a little bit more, a little bit later on. But now they're seeing the crowd flock there. So imagine yourself on the boat with Jesus and the disciples, and they run ashore, and they see the crowd. They have not been able to take a breath. They have not been able to take a bite to eat. Maybe something on the boat. I think any one of us would have been frustrated at the very best. But again, none of us are ourselves when we're tired and exhausted, we're hungry, we just want to take a nap. But how does Jesus reply? Like when he steps out on the boat and he sees this crowd, this massive, probably 15,000 group of people, is he going to get frustrated when he sees that they don't get to take a break? Is his mind numb? Is he annoyed at their presumption of what's going to happen? Because again, the crowds in the book of Mark tend to be a hindrance to ministry instead of a good thing. Is that how Jesus is going to react when he steps off the boat? No, he has compassion on them. And that word in the Greek, compassion, is this deep, gut-wrenching empathy that he has. Because when he looks at the crowd, right, he doesn't see a hindrance. He doesn't see another 12 hours of service that's going to leave him drained and exhausted. And he's going to hear about this complaint from his disciples for the next 2 weeks. Right? He doesn't see all of that. He sees sheep without a shepherd. He sees the lost sheep of Israel. He sees his mission. He came to seek and save the lost. And so here, Jesus is demonstrating something. Right? He's shepherding his own disciples just as much as he's shepherding the people when he goes and does the miracle of dividing the food for them. He's showing them how to have compassion on people who are lost. No matter what your current condition is, even if you're exhausted, right, don't give in to frustration, don't give in to anger. See them for what's really going on. They have no idea what their need is. A lot of them are there because they want to see the miracles or they want to be healed, but they don't necessarily want Jesus. They just want their life to improve or they want to be entertained. They may not even know what their vast need is, but Jesus is going to show it to them. And from that vantage point, there's abundant compassion. It reminds me of Paul saying, don't grow weary of doing good. That's what Jesus is demonstrating to his disciples in this moment. Right? So that's the human need that he is seeing. And he's helping his disciples understand that as they step onto the shores and they get in the midst of the crowd. But Jesus is showing them something else too. And he doesn't always overtly say this. Sometimes he does. We see that in some of the other Gospels. But again, Mark is very action-driven, so he is just showing this to them. And I think for the first century Jew, these types of parallels would have been a little bit more obvious to them than it is to us. But this is the God who provides. This is Jesus being a new and better Moses for them. And I want to unpack what that means. When Jesus steps on the shore and he sees this giant crowd, this is Ezekiel 34:11. This is the God of creation, the sovereign Lord, saying, I myself will search for my sheep, and I will look after them. There's other instances in Scripture where God says that I myself will come and shepherd you. If you look through the Old Testament, in the past, he had done that through intermediaries, and Moses is one of the most apparent representations of that. And look at the parallel of what Moses did in leading the people out of Egypt and what Jesus is doing here with his disciples and with this massive crowd in a wilderness area. See, Moses was ordained by God to lead his people out of Egypt, right? So there was a freedom there. But again, they didn't get to go to the promised land right off. Or there was a promise to bring them into that. But they had to go into the wilderness first. Now, they got to take more provisions with them than the disciples did when they went out 2 by 2. But when you go into the wilderness, and there was a lot of Hebrews, you're going to go through those provisions really fast. So what did God do for them? He provided manna. He provided a heavenly bread for them to eat that was sufficient enough for them for each day. Right? And when they would camp, and when Moses was trying to shepherd them, through the advice of his father-in-law, he would group up all the people in groups of thousands and hundreds and fifties and tens. And through some of the delegation of his leadership, he would shepherd the people in the wilderness. And that went on and on and on until it was time to come into the promised land. And when Moses was not permitted to go into the promised land, right, that mantle of leadership was given to Joshua, which technically in Hebrew, right, is Yeshua's Jesus. You have a parallel of Jesus being like Joshua, right, actually leading people into the promised land. But what is Jesus going to do here? He's showing people their vast need for him. Right? He's going to feed them with bread, right? The bread of life, giving physical bread to them in the wilderness, demonstrating their need, right, for the promised land. But it's not going to be a physical place. He's the one bringing the kingdom of God to earth. So Jesus is the new Moses, establishing a new and better covenant for his people. Moses himself said, man does not live by bread alone, but every word that comes from the mouth of God. It was right. That's what Jesus quoted to Satan in the wilderness when he was being tempted. And Jesus is that word made flesh. So I don't want us to miss these parallels and fulfillments of what Jesus is doing. Because again, he's not going to say it overtly, but he's living it out. That Jesus is giving them himself, the bread of life, as he's giving them the physical food that they need for their bodies. So he sees this, but he doesn't immediately go to that first physical need, does he? What's the very first thing he does as the bread of life? He teaches them. It's an all-day teaching because it gets late toward the time when he's done teaching. Their ultimate need is not food. Their ultimate need is spiritual nourishment. Right? And their leaders weren't giving it to them. But the Pharisees were more like the hired hands that we read about, not the shepherd himself. And the fact that they were willing to sprint around the top of the Sea of Galilee to get to where Jesus was shows just the extreme nature of their need. And Jesus gave them that first, spiritual nourishment. Okay? Now the physical nourishment is going to come, and the disciples see that. And so this comes with the man's plans. Right? It's getting late. Jesus is finishing his teaching. They're in a remote place. All of these people are not native, right? Because they followed them there. So the disciples come up with an incredibly reasonable, logical plan. All right, Jesus, I see you winding it down. It's getting dark. Like, why don't you just go ahead and dismiss them, let them go into the surrounding villages and towns, and let them go get something to eat. Okay, modern day translation, right? In a Baptist church, like it is 12:01. Golden Corral, like the Methodists and the Presbys are going to beat us there. Like, wrap it up. It's time to go eat. But also, all joking aside, right? This is a good plan. I mean, this is really logical. I think any of us would say the exact same thing, right? And their compassion was genuine, I believe, right? So, despite the practicality of this, though, Jesus was trying to teach them something in this moment. And did you notice that they were telling Jesus what to do instead of asking him what to do? Right? It was their plans. Jesus, you need to do this so that they can go be provided for. Okay? That's man's plans. But they weren't seeking God's plans. Jesus had something very different in store. Something mind-blowingly impossible. Again, I don't know if you have thought through just how impossible this is. But before we get to that description, I mean, just can anyone relate to God turning your plans upside down? Right? And like, we can be transparent here. That can get annoying. That was my plans. That was a good plan. Why didn't you bless that plan? God is teaching us to seek him and his plans and his will. And sometimes, right, when we're so quick to act on our man-made plans, we miss his supernatural provisions and the plans that he has for us to show us more of who he is. And that's what he wants to demonstrate to his disciples. He wants to show him his plan, right? God's plan. In 4 simple words, completely turned upside down their practical planning. You give them food. You give them food. Think about that for a minute. I actually took a picture. So last night, we took the youth, Joni and I did, to Winter Jam. Winter Jam was in the Coliseum in Greensboro. Here's a small snapshot of this. Greensboro Stadium can seat about 22,000 people. And behind the stage, right, so the stage is on ground level, so all of that seating behind the stage is empty. Now, there's some seating on the ground floor. But essentially, what was in there is about what could have been with this crowd on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. So I want you to think about that. I mean, that's one side of the stadium. So think about that filling 3/4 of the stadium. I was sitting there, and I was just looking around, knowing that I was going to preach this today. And I was trying to wrap my head around what the disciples were thinking. Because I was looking at a crowd that was roughly equivalent to what they were facing. And I had after I spent all the money on the tickets and the parking, and I had $20 left in my pocket. Right. I was trying to, literally, I was thinking all the vendors, if they were shut down and everybody wanted to eat, and Jesus said, you do it. I'm looking at that crowd, I'm like, how on earth? I really could relate to what the disciples were thinking. That's impossible. There's no way. So put yourself in that stadium, look at the crowd around you, and imagine Jesus looking at you and say, you do it. Can you just see their jaws dropping to the floor, being like, how? How on earth? And they did what any one of us would do. They started going through their provisions. They're thinking through the cost. They're like, this is going to cost 200 denarii. A denarii is A day laborer's wage, like one day's wage is 1 denarii. And they're thinking that's like 200 days worth of pay. That's like 8 months of your salary to go and just get bread for these people. But again, they're calculating from a human perspective. Right? And that's not to discount planning. That's not to discount wise planning. Jesus himself said, right, a builder should sit down and calculate and make sure that he has the sufficient funds, right, to start or to finish something that he started. But that was given during a time for practical daily provisions. Right? And that is practical daily wisdom. Make sure you have sufficient means. But this is not that scenario. This is Jesus looking at them and saying, do something impossible. And during those times, this is a lesson for us. We should not rely on what we have. Right? They started calculating their resources. What Jesus was trying to teach them is look at my resources. Have I not shown you up until this point that I'm sufficient? Have I not shown you that I can provide for you? Have I not put you in impossible situations already? And I asked you to your face, where's your faith? It was another test in the wilderness. Are you going to look to me as your source of provision? But instead, they took out their tablet calculator or their, what are those things? Abacus. Yeah, they said, the abacus, trying to calculate stuff. What is going on? How are we going to do this? Right, hopefully, you're beginning to grasp just how impossible of a situation. Like, this was an impossible request from Jesus. And an impossible request requires radical trust. Right, now that's this great tagline. And we can get behind that and be like, yeah, we need to radically trust in Jesus. But when you're in a situation like this, that's not what we go to. It's not our first mindset. Our first mindset is, what I have is completely insufficient. And you start doubting, and like all your mind just wanders on all these things of how impossible, instead of looking at Jesus and saying, through you all things are possible. And everything is sufficient in you. So think through just a few things of what Jesus has asked of his disciples. Just a couple stories back, right? Not even throughout the whole book of Mark so far. We're only in chapter 6. How about the Sea of Galilee when the storm hit? Right? And their boat was about to capsize. They were terrified because they were literally in mortal danger. Okay? They feared for their safety. Jesus, when they woke them up, said, where's your faith? Right? That was an impossible situation. How about the woman who had the 12-year medical issue? Like, she stepped out in faith, knowing that Jesus was the only answer because she had a physical need. She needed health restored to her body. Again, think about Jairus and his daughter who was sick at first and now she's died. And Jesus looks at him and goes, stop fearing. Only believe. The very necessity of life, the fact that God controls the breath in my lungs. Or how about the most recent thing where they had to go out into the region 2 by 2 with almost nothing and trust God for every provision, right, for food and shelter. Jesus is teaching them like the basic necessities of life. Safety, food, shelter, health, life, all of those things just in these recent stories. Jesus is saying, I'm sufficient for those needs. You're going to trust me with those, or you're not going to trust me with those. I'm calling you to radically trust in my provision. At the moment, the disciples were thinking, where on earth is this going to come from? Makes me think of Psalm 121. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. Right? The God who created the galaxies. You don't think that he can multiply bread and fish, that he can provide. He can turn stones into bread if he wants to. I know that was what Satan said to Jesus, but it's not as if that was impossible for him. There's a reason why he said it. Jesus can provide even in the most dire of circumstances. And now he goes on to show them his provision. He said, okay, I can see your doubt. Let me show you again my provision for you. And not just the provision, but fulfillment. I want you to see fulfillment in this. We already talked about Moses, how Jesus is the new and better Moses. Right? He's leading the people in the wilderness toward the promised land, the provision of God, but right, that's the spiritual kingdom, not an earthly kingdom. Think about Psalm 23, though. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, right, that one. This is a fulfillment of that. Jesus called himself the Good Shepherd in John chapter 10. And this is a very good shepherd in Psalm 23, right? Jesus, the Lord, an agent of creation here is their shepherd who sits them down in green pastures. Right? Mark mentions green grass. Right? He's leading them beside the still waters of his teaching that gives them life and nourishment. He's setting them down like Moses did in that green grass in hundreds and fifties, Mark tells us. Right? Through his delegated leaders, just like Moses did, right? With his disciples leading the way. He's even preparing a table for them of feasting. Right? That's why this is called the shepherd's banquet. Because not only is the wilderness, right, a place of testing, but oftentimes when we go through a time of testing, there's a tester. When Jesus went in the wilderness, Satan tested him. When demons were cast out, they go through dry and desolate places. Jesus is showing not only his disciples, not only the lost sheep of Israel, right, but the forces that he has been casting out, I will provide for my people, even in your midst. And the people don't even know that goodness and mercy are pursuing them, right? They're pursuing Jesus, but Jesus is also pursuing them. This is a picture and fulfillment of the Good Shepherd, as we see in Psalm 23. The fulfillment of what Moses did. Moses himself said, there's going to be another prophet that comes after me. You need to listen to him. That's who Jesus is. And even this allusion to a banquet feast where Jesus is providing for all of them, there's a parallel there to the wannabe Herod. Right? Wannabe Herod, he is Herod. The wannabe king who threw a banquet for himself so he could exalt himself, and he would sacrifice John the Baptist so that he could maintain, right, his image in front of all of his high-powered friends. And yet Jesus is providing the same banquet, but he is the true king, the King of Kings, that is willing to sacrifice himself and his needs for the benefit of the flock. Like all of these fulfillments. That's what I'm saying. There's so much here. Like none of us are going to remember all of this. But surely there's one thing that will speak to you. We're going to come to a close in just a minute. Let's talk about the actual miracle that he does. When Jesus says, you do it, I want you to feed them. He says, go and find, what do you have? Go and see what your provisions are. Right now, another gospel tells us that they go get pretty much a kid's Lunchable. Right? It's 5 loaves, and they're barley loaves, so it's the bread of poor people. Barley's cheaper than, right, some of the other wheats. 2 fish, probably salted or pickled, somehow preserved to be able to travel. They bring it to Jesus. And that was a kid's lunch. I said the barley loaves are probably pretty small. And they said, this is what we have. Like, recognize, like, Jesus does not need anything from us, but he wants us to give him what we have. Go and see what you have, give that to me, and see what I can do with it. This is part of the radical trust that Jesus is asking from his disciples. And don't miss the reality that while Jesus is the one doing the miracle, he's distributing it through his disciples. We have a part to play. Imagine what it was like for the disciples. Like, I don't know how many of them actually got to see Jesus like break bread and then it just like miraculously regenerates in his hand. Just imagine what that would have looked like for them. But Jesus' power is on display. But then he's handing it off to his disciples. He's commissioning them to actually go and do the work to feed, just like he did when he sent them out 2 by 2. To me, this is a foreshadow of what he's going to send them off to do in the Great Commission. My power through your hands. So we can't miss that. That was true for the disciples. They were the ones doing it. But that's true for you and me too. His delegated power is entrusted to us. Not that he needs us, but he chooses to work through us to bring the message of the gospel to the nations. The bread of life, the message of him in our hands to distribute to the world. You see the parallel. And he doesn't give us that, right, with scarcity. He gives it to us in abundance. It's the last thing we'll talk about before we come to a close today. Right? He didn't just give barely enough like to curb the hunger of 15-ish thousand people. He fed them until they were fully satisfied. Like, I don't need any more. Thank you very much. That was amazing. Completely and fully satisfied in what Jesus provided for them. Nothing else, that'll preach. For most of us, right? Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of everything that we need. But he didn't even stop there. They collected 12 basketfuls of leftovers. Right now, there's a lot of talk about what all of these numbers mean. Some people get like super deep into numerology. I don't think we need to do that. We have to dive super deep into what the 5 meant with the bread and the 2 means for the fish, 12 means for the baskets. I do think that the 12, right, that 12 is a number of completion and full provision. You have the 12 tribes of Israel that represented the fullness of God's people. You have the 12 disciples, the foundation of the church. But I think it's even more practical than that. The disciples didn't get to eat before they made the trek, and they were distributing to everybody else. How many baskets were left over? Could it be that Jesus just wanted to provide for his frontline men? Here's a basket for you. Here's a basket for you. I want to provide for you because I'm discipling you. You provided for them, I provide for you. I think that's what the 12 means. Jesus knows our needs intimately, and he will fulfill our every need. All right, so as we come to a close today, again, I just want to encourage you. Don't try to retain all of this. But I do want to recap a couple of the big points that I think many of us can take away. So take one of these and apply that piece. Later on, if you're in a different place, apply another piece. But the first thing is, how about that beginning part of the rhythms of work and rest? We live in a workaholic society. I know that applies to some of us. We need to learn the rhythm of work and rest and realize that we're not being lazy. We're not folding on our responsibilities. It's biblical. It's a provision, and it is a grace for us to rest in Jesus and allow him to fill us back up. Okay, you can't operate out of nothing. You can't run on an empty tank. Right? That's one takeaway. Another one is recognizing, right, the impossible commands and his supernatural provision. Recognizing that if you are in a place right now of scarcity, and honestly, this is the one that hits closest to me, I don't need to do more. There are some times where I just need to rest in his provision. And I need to recognize that if I'm in a place of scarcity, that's not even necessarily my fault. That may be a testing ground for me to stop trying to do more and more and to simply trust and rest in his provision. Radical trust that is unbelievably uncomfortable when you're forced to trust that way. And yet, that's when we see his abundant provision. Maybe some of us relate to that piece. Or maybe if some of us need to recognize what he can do with our small offerings. Maybe we ourselves feel insignificant, or maybe we recognize that our provisions are just minuscule. And when what we have seems little, we don't even want to give that because it's just embarrassing how little we actually have to give. And we need to recognize Jesus wants that. Again, not because he needs it, because he wants to show you what he can do through it, through a hand that's open and willing to trust in what God can do with that little thing, whatever that is. So we need to remember this week that the God who fed the 5,000, right, with bread and fish, he's the same yesterday, today, and forever. Don't think about this abundant provision in terms of a story in the past. Think about his provision for you today. Let me pray. Jesus, thank you so much for your abundant provision. Thank you for putting us in uncomfortable situations where we come to the end of ourselves. And like we sang before I came up here, if more of you means less of me, take it all. Because we want to see your power lived in our lives. So that we can grow in our faith, our radical trust in who you are. But more importantly, we can see you high and lifted up in our own world, in our own circumstances. Because if you get to be exalted through my life, and I know that I don't understand the fullness of my impact when I say this, put me through anything if it exalts you. And in the moments where I regret those words, remind me that it's all about you. It's truly all about you. Help me to trust. And let me praise you when you abundantly provide. And I pray that for all of us. I pray in Jesus' mighty name.